This week on To the Contrary. First, are abortion rights, gay rights, and affirmative action goners as Justice Anthony Kennedy exits the Supreme Court? Then, what does Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez Wins, a Bernie Sanders organizer against an establishment male Democrat, portend for the midterms? And Jemele Hill on her Twitter battle with President Trump. Hello, I'm Bonnie Urbay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, change on the way for the Supreme Court. Right now, it's a guessing game as to who will replace Justice Anthony Kennedy on the bench. But court watchers say for his second Supreme Court pick, President Trump will nominate a seriously conservative jurist and move the court farther right. Kennedy, who was nominated by Ronald Reagan, mainly voted with conservatives on such issues as gun control, voting rights, and campaign finance. He was the swing vote in the landmark same-sex marriage decision and cases involving abortion access and affirmative action. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says he wants the Senate to vote on the Trump nominee before the midterms, but Democrats want it delayed until after November, since McConnell refused to allow a vote on President Obama's nominee for more than a year. So if a conservative president were elected, he could nominate a conservative jurist. So Latifa, what does this mean for the future of women's rights, gay rights, and affirmative action? In other words, all civil rights.
It means the most serious threat that we've seen to all of those rights that you mentioned in a very long time.
On women's rights, not as bad. Gay rights, not as bad. Affirmative action, yeah, I think maybe gone.
Say goodbye to all those rights and welcome to The Handmaid's Tale.
I think we're looking at an environment where we're going to see states being more in control than SCOTUS is at this point in terms of future policy.
Well, yeah, but that means throw it to the states. That means the red states will ban all those rights, and the blue states will keep some, if not all of them.
Right, but when we start with women's rights and we start with policies like Roe v. Wade, we're not going to see Roe v. Wade overturned tomorrow. What we're going to see is a series of policies at the state level to restrict and limit access for women in certain cases, which is already going on in a number of red states.
Do you agree with that?
I really am anticipating the worst, and I think it's insane that in the year 2018, the women's rights movement in America is really held hostage to this issue. And I think with this opening right now in the Supreme Court, it's just going to set the entire women's movement back, and that affects women's movements around the world. What happens in America matters.
I think you're going to be surprised. I think he's going to appoint a woman, and I think that Senators Collins and Murkowski are going to make sure somebody who respects precedent, and that Roe is not going to be gone, and that gay rights are not going to be adversely affected because of precedent.
The Democrats have an opportunity to hold this up as long as possible. I mean, obviously,
but they can't. I mean, the Senate's already gone to the nuclear option, so they can't filibuster anymore. Mm-hmm. I mean, they have no power. The only power they have is hoping that the three so-called moderate Republican senators side with them.
Right, which is possible, and we know that they have come out before. Murkowski, you mentioned, but for sure, there are certain advances that we've made, particularly around gay marriage. I would just point that out as something that was one of the most significant changes in the past decade, and agreeing that at the state level, this is really opening the floodgates. And there are a lot of folks who are, frankly, just scared about how they're going to live their lives, frankly, in light of this vacancy.
Yeah, very interesting piece in the New York Times saying by a woman who studied abortion rights in Central and South America, I think maybe globally, saying that because of RU 486 and misoprostol and the morning Plan after B, pill, and et cetera, Plan B, that abortion rights are really not that much in question anymore around the world, because even if, for example, those drugs were banned in the U.S., you could get them worldwide on the internet. So, however, she notes that certain states, like the very southern states that criminalize abortion, more often the women who have abortions who are poor are prosecuted than women who are well-to-do. And that will happen.
Well, you're right to bring up what you've said, because the world has changed dramatically since 1973 when Roe was first decided. There are many other alternatives. We certainly don't want them going back to back alley abortion. I don't think it's going to get there. I think we're going to get somebody who will uphold precedent, and if we don't...
Why don't you say that why don't you ask the evangelical Christians running your party right now, because they've been on TV and on the radio and in the newspaper saying that's exactly what they want. And they control this president.
Yes, and they also thought David Souter was going to be with them, and he wasn't. And I was right about that back then, and I'm going to be right about it again. And let me predict this right here, right now.
Please.
If we get somebody who isn't good on precedent, you're going to see Roberts, in particular, switch and become the Kennedy of the court.
I don't understand, after 17 months, why people don't believe Trump and what he says. He already said he believes there should be some kind of punishment for women who seek abortions. This is the reason
if the evangelical... If there was a total ban...
I let you finish.
You actually interrupted.
Excuse me.
I don't want to argue about
I don't either.
Go ahead.
No, I think that Trump is very clear about what he's going to be doing, and that's the reason the evangelicals backed him for what he's doing to the court.
I actually covered the court for 9 years in the late 90s, and I always used to believe, seeing the balance that was up there, that even though some conservatives on the court might want to see Roe overturned, they wouldn't do it because of the reaction they would get from the left. Millennials, Gen X, Y, Z, all who have always lived with abortion rights, they were afraid would take to the streets and protest like crazy. But this crowd is different. It's totally different. It's much farther right than any other presidency of my lifetime, and probably in the last, till the middle of the last, millennium. So not millennium, 100 years. So what are your thoughts? You're in the party. What do you think?
In my opinion, I think one of the things that I focus on with the Supreme Court especially is this is obviously a significant moment in this generation, in the future of the actual court, and the leverage that Republicans and the right will have on significant issues like affirmative action, civil rights, et cetera. My bigger concern, and what we should be paying attention to, is when the court becomes a 6-3 court instead of a 5-4 court. You talk about that center and that idea that Kennedy was a firewall on important issues of the day, even though he was still a conservative.
Individual rights.
Correct. And so in my mindset, I think that you have to worry, if you're a liberal, about the fact that you could have another appointment in the near future. This is the first of many, and I do think that, despite contrarian beliefs, that there's a reasonable assumption that he would nominate a woman, and that may provide some level of a backstop to give people comfort. But I know there's a tremendous amount of anxiety.
There are plenty of very conservative women. Sure. Ann Gorsuch, mother of Justice.
But I agree with Ann that I don't think that you can sit here and say definitively that because someone's a conservative that this is exactly what they're going to do. And I think that's the other part of this, whether they're a woman or whatever. I think we've looked at Kennedy on things like gay rights. He was obviously very, not progressive, but he did a lot of things that conservatives may not have loved.
I really wish I had...
Latifa.
Last week's decisions, I think, were a forecast. Unlike many of his votes in the past, Kennedy essentially sided with all the decisions that came out of the last session with the conservatives, and I think that was a preview. One of the very particular cases that I think is important for this debate is around crisis pregnancy centers. For example, that wasn't about Roe v. Wade, but it was about the ability in these remote areas where women don't have any reproductive health, that you have these crisis, quote unquote, pregnancy centers masquerading as health clinics. There are women not just having trouble accessing abortion services, they're having trouble accessing birth control, obstetrics care, and I think that there are, beyond this issue of Roe v. Wade, there are a multitude of things, and I think Kennedy's decisions, the last vote gave us a glimpse into what those things could look like.
Why did you say? I'm curious, Ann, and you ran. I don't think you have it anymore, but Republicans for Choice for many years, we should note. But why did you bring up that he will nominate a woman? Because we now know that, he could nominate a very conservative woman, and it wouldn't make a difference. And Republicans always say, the women always say, we're no different from the men.
There are conservatives and there are conservatives. I do think it'll be a woman because I think the optics will be great. And he's got 6 out of 25.
Not optics.
Yeah, I think 6 out of 25 that he's looking at are female. And there's some really good ones there, and I think that's a very likely thing. And again, there are conservatives and conservatives. Souter was supposed to be, so conservative when they appointed him, and I kept saying, he's going to be with us. I'm getting the same sort of readout that either that will happen or we'll have one of the sitting justices, because the violation of precedent is something that doesn't happen very often on the Supreme Court. And I think Roberts will move over just as he did on Obamacare.
All right. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter and at Bonnie Urbay and at To the Contrary, from SCOTUS to the Progressive Democrats. In what could become a pivotal moment in liberal politics, a 28-year-old Latina and Democratic Socialist ousted a 10-term incumbent congressman. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, running her first campaign, defeated Representative Joe Crowley in a Democratic primary in New York. Crowley, the fourth-ranking Democrat in the House, outraised her by 10-1. But Cortez energized voters with a strong grassroots campaign. Cortez, an activist, ran to Crowley's left on issues such as immigration and health care. Crowley's loss has been compared to former GOP Majority Leader Eric Cantor's loss to an insurgent Tea Party-backed candidate in 2014. Political forecasters are asking whether this is the start of a sea change in liberal spheres as we near the midterm elections. Young voters now make up a larger percentage of the Democratic Party than they have in the last 20 years, and they are more likely to identify as socialist. So, Ann, in the upcoming midterms, who's a bigger challenge to the Democratic candidates? They're far left, as represented by this woman who won the primary, or Republicans?
Definitely the left wing of the party, which is dragging it farther and farther from the mainstream. When more of their policies are illuminated by Republican ads, it's going to be a real problem for them. But just the internal battle they have in the Democratic side is not helpful for them.
Well, I do think that the galvanizing, one of the things that the Ocasio said in response to her win was they are mobilizing folks who don't vote. Part of our polling problem, as she pointed out, is that we're polling the expected, off mainstream primary, not a presidential election year. She had teenagers out voting for her for the first time. We have to mobilize.
Right, but they said that about Obama, and it didn't happen anywhere near enough numbers to make it significant.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a couple of things about this. This is my mother's district, where a lot of my family live, and it's adjacent to where I grew up. And
I grew up in Manhattan.
And not naming any names, I think it's sending a message to a lot of folks that the heir apparents of our time, how we think about politics, is starting to change. Just next door, we've got Engels District, we've got Serrano. Folks who've been in for a very long time. This particular demographic, however, was one of the few that was essentially, he was representing people who were majority minority, as we say. And I think that the demographics have changed. The Democratic Party and folks in those positions have not been keeping up with the changes in their district. And it's representing the people is what's moving folks. I don't think that it's liberal or not. At this point, there's a crisis of confidence in our elected officials. And I think that is what's going to motivate people to make a change in our party.
Jen, your thoughts?
I'm interested in the fact that someone like Ocasio-Cortez has won, being young. She's the kind of candidate that you want to see, in the sense that she's young and she's a minority and she's outspoken and she didn't raise money. She did entirely a grassroots effort. What concerns me is that she's a socialist, and I think that when we talk about sort of the party and the issues that Democrats have, you're going to see that issue of moving to the left. There was a stat that said that the majority of young people under 30 don't believe in capitalism. And so you're starting to see these patterns of behavior where I wonder if candidates like Ocasio-Cortez are the not the average, but the opposite of that. And so I think we're looking at a different environment where I don't know that you can count it as a trend, as more than an anomaly than a trend.
Do you think it hurts, the Bernie Sanders wing hurts the Democrats?
I think the Democrats have a lot of problems on their hands, and I think in many ways Ocasio kind of personifies everything that we need to do. Focus on messaging, focus on people of color, and focusing on young people.
Yeah, but what about her? Do older Democrats vote in very large numbers too. They don't want socialism.
Yeah.
And moderates, the suburban Democrats, don't want socialism.
Well, I think there's a real power push going on in the party right now. I think in many ways we're still kind of recovering and having an identity crisis from the elections. And I think it's important that she is really kind of regalvanizing the party on things that we need to focus on.
She's 60 years younger than the leadership in the Democratic Party. Let that sink in. 60 years younger.
Right, but
wow.
But I grew up a very hard left liberal in New York City during the 60s, and I went to the Vietnam War protests, and I did everything else that teenagers in the 60s did, but we weren't talking about socialism.
No.
There was a wave of interest in politics at that time, like now, among young people, but we weren't that. We were different from our parents. We were more concerned about overpopulation. We were more concerned about the environment, certainly, but not on financial issues. And I just think this could be the Democrats' undoing.
Well, I think that part of what we are seeing across the country is that there are candidates who are trying to dig beneath the surface of what we think of as who goes to the polls and how these campaigns work. And what we've seen in various races, Stacey Abrams, lots of folks, women of color around the country who are speaking to a base that hasn't been spoken to before.
But who, unlike Ocasio-Cortez, doesn't have a chance.
Well, I think that, again, some of these folks are going to do well and not. I think people would have argued that she didn't have Ocasio-Cortez didn't have a chance either. Some of this comes down to organizing, and some of this comes down to, campaigns and strategies and how well you know your district. I think the most compelling thing about this race is that it was very grassroots and it was very of the people. And I think there are some folks who are very vulnerable in their districts because they have no longer represented who lives back in their district. And this guy was a perfect example of this. There's lots of reports that he's very much not in district. His kids don't go to school there. That's not necessarily the case all around.
He didn't show up for debates.
Right, but I think that there are pockets of places where we have really moved away from our constituents, and this is an example of speaking to the folks and meeting them where they are.
Okay, behind the headlines, Jemele Hill has been lauded for her work as a sports writer who doesn't shy away from social and political issues. Recently, she was named Journalist of the Year by the National Association of Black Journalists, but she's earned her fair share of critics too, President Trump among them. Quote, ESPN is paying a really big price for its politics, end quote, tweeted President Trump. This after Jemele Hill, then a host of ESPN's flagship show, Sportscenter, called him a white supremacist.
When I started as a sports writer, I never looked at it as seeing myself as using a platform to accomplish anything other than the journalistic basics of accuracy, fairness, and truth. But over time, what you discover is that your ability to bring awareness or attention to certain issues is the activism in itself.
Hill was suspended for 2 weeks for violating ESPN's social media policy. She eventually moved away from hosting SportsCenter and towards writing for an ESPN website called The Undefeated.
The entire mission of the site is to cover the intersection between race, sports, and culture. I'm in a natural home that allows me to write about some significant, important issues through the lens of sports. And it's something I've always wanted to do. It's something I've done throughout my career.
Hill is one of the most visible black women in the sports writing field.
There's a lot of industries in this country that are male-dominated, but sports is very different because it's not just male-dominated. It also, everything about it is decidedly male. The feel of it, the texture of it. Sports has been conditioned or presented to us and positioned in our society as something men do. And, what happens, I think, is that the presence of women, there's this automatic questioning. I mean, it was always important in my career that I had a sense of belonging. I was lucky because I had that early. And as a result, I never thought that sports was something that I shouldn't be doing because I was a woman.
Statistics show 90% of sports editors are white and 90% are male.
I often tell younger female journalists that want to get into sports is that there are some things that unfortunately you have to put up with if you want to continue to make your way in this career. I mean, you're going to be held to a different standard at times, criticized more at times, and it can be tough at times. But ultimately, it's rewarding because you're doing something that you love to do.
She has been one of the NFL's sharpest critics when it comes to its policies against protesting police violence during the national anthem. Recently, team owners agreed on new guidelines that punish players and teams for kneeling during the anthem.
What they've discovered is that they can't control this narrative. They've openly challenged the dignity of their players and made them feel suppressed. And so now, if you're a player and you weren't thinking about protesting, now you may do it just on principle.
New York Times reporter Greg Howard said the subtext of the backlash she received after speaking out about this issue was, quote, "Who said this black woman can mouth off?" End quote.
There are perceptions about, black women being angry, too aggressive, all those things that at some point in terms of how people characterize you, they do come into play. As if, we're being more forceful than anybody else. It's just one of those unfortunate stereotypes and perceptions that you have to deal with because it is, it's something I'm aware of, but something I don't capitulate to. It's not going to stop me from giving my opinion.
So, Jen, does she help African-American women in sports or hurt them by crossing over the line into covering politics and making public her opinion about political issues?
Sure. I'm the first person to watch the Oscars or any celebrity being outspoken about something that they shouldn't be and say, stay in your lane. Like, why are you talking about this? But I think Ms. Hill had an important opportunity here as someone who does speak about culture and plays a unique role in an industry that is very white male dominated, to tell her story. I'd be stunned if she didn't say something and wasn't outspoken. Now, whether it was good for ESPN or not, or good for African-American women, as an African-American woman, I would have been stunned if she didn't say something. So I applaud her for that, and it's unfortunate that she was penalized for that.
You agree? Anushay?
Oh, sorry, yes. I thought we were going to go to the black woman first. I don't, much respect to Jemele Hill. She has every right to speak out, and Trump has a very clear pattern of really not liking it, not only when people criticize him, but when women criticize him and women of color. So speaking out on such a political issue and then having the president attack you and then being suspended from your work, I mean, I have a lot of respect for her.
But what about the fact that he made her career? I mean, he should be smart enough to know that he should keep his mouth shut on Twitter, especially about relative unknowns. He's going to make them famous. He's going to do more for their career than they ever could have done for themselves.
I don't care if she expresses her opinion, but the American people don't like politics mixed in with their sports. We've seen that. So whether
what about
Trump
a
commented on it or not,
who hurls personal insults at
tells those
people who are otherwise relatively
play.
insignificant and then makes them significant?
He's an equal opportunity offender.
There are a lot.
That doesn't make it okay.
Sports, I have to say, especially today, it's riddled with politics. The idea that we don't have politics in sports is sort of,
right. And the American people don't like that.
But the president is telling
the company roles that she has is one question. But as a person who literally is at the margins of this field, to not have that intersection play out at some point, it was just unrealistic.
Well, let her be a pundit. The American people don't like sports and politics. We've seen that with declining attendance.
All punditry.
We have seen the attendance decline across the sports where there's been more politics introduced.
But how do
why in this day and age are sports editors and writers still 90% male and white?
That's
I don't get that. That's
a good question.
How could that happen?
On every sector. Are you really going to take my old white men line from me? I thought you hated that. They're everywhere, Bonnie.
No, but they're not 90% of every field in this day and age. They're certainly, 30 years ago, they weren't 90% of my law school class.
They're about to be 90% of the Supreme Court unless this magical woman appears.
Your thoughts?
My thoughts are that, this is a field while the players and even the consumers definitely are not all white or in any way, the community and the people who are in charge and run and hold the purses and manage are by and large white men. And so they're the ones who are telling the stories. They're the ones who are picking the players. They're the ones who are writing the checks.
That's a field that clearly its bosses need a little bit of education. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/tothecontrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.